How do you get your best bang for buck when undertaking a planting project on the farm? What are some key things you can do to increase your chances of success? And what are some common mistakes to avoid? Welcome to episode 52 of Talking Dairy. My name is Ben Chapman-Smith. Our three guests on this episode each bring a different perspective. Firstly, Morrinsville farmer Johan van Ras generously shares not just how he went about planting 4 hectares on his farm, but also the mistakes he made and what he's learned from the process. We're also joined by Antony Snodgrass, who with his brother Matt runs a Waikato-based native tree planting company called Koroniki. He shares some of the common missteps they see farmers making with planting, plus plenty of tips for getting it right, from the prep work through to the maintenance. And lastly, DairyNZ's Aslan Wright-Stow, our Senior Manager Environment, comes in with what the science tells about how to do planting well, particularly riparian planting, and what benefits you can expect. A couple of very quick notes. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Talking Dairy podcast so you get notified when new episodes go live. And if you're heading along to Field Days this month, we'll be recording some live podcasts at the DairyNZ stand in the pavilion on Thursday, June 15th. Get details at dairynz.co.nz/field days. Let's get into it. Hey guys, fantastic to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining me. Johan, let's go to you first, mate. Tell us about the planting that you've done on your farm in Morrinsville. How much of the farm have you planted? When did you do it and why?
Yeah, so we're a 76 hectare farm just out of Morrinsville, and we've planted about 4.5 hectares of wetland sort of bush, just waste area on the farm, plus our main tributaries. We've started a bit of a Carex trial with neighbours and things like that. And the reason why, out the back, it's just a bit of a waste area. It's always been on the cards to do that sort of thing, but this takes time. So, it was just the right thing to do was the main reason. Yeah, to get there took a bit longer.
So you've got 76 hectares and you've planted 4 of it, is that right?
Yep, that's right.
Tell me about the process. Like, when did you start?
Yeah, the process is we've been there about 12 years, so it has been on the cards when we first moved there, but you got to try to get all your other farm systems in place first before you really get stuck into putting trees in the ground and that sort of thing. So we focused for the first few years on the efficiency of the farm business, and then we moved into we've got some funds to put into a riparian area or wetland area. Yeah, so that process started in 2019. I had the Waikato Regional Council come out and just say, hey, what do we do here, guys? And he said, you first focus on a tiny little area, and Dad said to me, look, there's no point. I'm going to be dead by the time that whole thing's going to get done. So let's do the whole thing because I want to see it before I'm gone. So we just did the whole thing at once. And I think you got me in to work out what mistakes I made. So I'm definitely your man for that. But yeah, it started in 2019 and we're still working on it today and forever, I'd say.
When you say you're still working on it today, what does that look like? Is that the maintenance or are you still actually planting it?
When you do something like this, you don't just start and then it's the end of it. Hey, I've got this bush. It's constant pest control, weed control. Plants die. You're learning for where plants were not planted in the right place. So you're going to have to replant with better species that should go in that area. That weed control, that's years of time just to let that bush establish. And I think once that bush establishes, that will become less, and then we'll move into all the other things that we need to control, like possums and rats and stoats and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, sure. Hey, so you said you got the council in. Did you get any other advice, or was that enough for you?
Yeah, the council came in because these things are expensive to help with a bit of the funding. So they have an EPA, so they pay 33% of the total costs. We also got some advice. It wasn't very technical. I was at the field days, and as I was leaving, I saw this stand. I walked in with all their trees and I was like, can you guys help me? And they helped me out with, at the time, with a 1 billion trees fund that was going about. Yeah, I went with them. They weren't a local one, but I would this is the things you learn. I'd use local nurseries from now on. They have local advice on plants and things like that grow in our area. So that was my mistake number one. But not that it was a mistake, but yeah, so they helped me out with advice of what plants and supplying the plants and helping with the funding application.
Yeah, sure. What about some of the other mistakes that you made? And thank you, by the way, for being willing to talk about those. We all make mistakes, and it's nice of you to share them.
Oh, no, I'll do it for the team, eh? Just know your space, know what you're trying to achieve and what's there. Like if you've got weeds, try to eliminate them beforehand. If you've got really wet areas, don't plant these sort of plants, plant these sort of plants. Those were mistakes that we made, and you'll learn from those as you go, but try not to, because it is expensive business.
So if you could go back and start again, I mean, it sounded like there was a big lead-in time before you actually started planting, but is there some other preparation that you would do if you could go back and redo that?
Yeah, mainly I've learned about plant density. Like using plant density would be better, because a lot of that weed control might have been easier to control with more dense plants, and investing that time in the plants at the start and a bit of control. And then, right plant in the right place. We had really wet areas that trees just don't survive in that stuff. So look at your grasses or a bit higher up, maybe your flaxes and things like that. I'll do that again a bit different, but it is what it is, eh?
Yeah, but and in saying
it still
that,
looks amazing.
Yeah, I was going to say, in saying that, are you happy with what you've got?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It looks awesome. Like one of the things I never knew, Dad and I pass each other a fair bit on the race, on the motorbikes. Where are you off to, Dad? Oh, I'm going to go check out the trees, and that's just what I've been doing. It's like I'm watching them every day grow. It's awesome. We go back there so much just to sit there and admire it. And that's one of the things I didn't think we'd do as often as we do. And you start to see the things happening. Insects are growing in the trees, so the pea waka wakas are turning up, and I think that's starting to come in. As much as maintenance and controlling the weeds, you're going to start seeing those benefits as well as time goes past.
Brilliant, man. Hey, Antony, you and your brother Matt run a native tree planting company here in the Waikato. What are the key things farmers should consider before they begin a planting project?
Yeah, so what Johan's basically said is 100% true. And so identify your goals. So what do you want to achieve, and where do you want to go with the planting that you're going to be doing? Is it riparian areas, or is it retirement areas on marginal land? It's all sort of slightly different. And then outline and understand the costs for the entire project. So you got fencing, plants and planting, and then ongoing maintenance. And like Johan said, the maintenance, it's not a huge cost in the overall scheme of things, but it does add up, and it definitely needs to be done. Like releasing is sort of like insurance or / servicing your tractor. If you don't do it, things go bad. And if you do it, things hum along nicely, and it definitely increases the success rate of your project. And that comes back to what Johan said, like if you're planting at 1.5 spacing, which is generally gold standard, if you release, you'll get really constant results at 1.5 spacing, whereas if you don't release, you'll get deaths, and then suddenly you're at 3 or bigger. Yeah, focus on priority areas first, like do your wetlands, and they're going to have your biggest bang for your buck in terms of an environmental standpoint, and they're generally your sort of more waste areas on the farm, like your stock shouldn't be in there, and they're quite easy to define. Most farmers aren't super concerned about wanting to put stock in there. They know they shouldn't. And then if you're a farmer that's got lots of planting to do, then the best way we've found is set a budget that you can sort of try and stick to each year. And that could be 1,500 trees, or it could be 5,000 trees. And then just go about it and do it properly. Like do it, if it needs to be done at 1.5 spacing, do it at 1.5 spacing, and just try and manage it and do it sort of right the first time, and spend your money on your maintenance rather than trying to plant heaps and then trying to catch up at a later date. And then the other thing about doing it that way is you build relationships with catchment management officers, a planting crew. Like if you've got a catchment group, they're a really good asset as well. And it's like anything, building a good team around you. You can get some funding. If you're seen to be doing lots and you're doing it properly, like you do a really good job of your fencing and all that sort of stuff, the money will almost flow to you. And yeah, you can just chip away at it over time, and the council will generally chip in that sort of 30 to 35%, but then there's also all sorts of other places to get money. But if you're seen to be doing something, then you definitely get more and more, basically.
You've probably covered some of this already, and Johan as well, but what are some of the most common mistakes that you see farmers making when it comes to planning and undertaking a planting project?
Yeah, like what Johan said, putting the wrong plants in the wrong place. And then also what we see quite often is people picking plants off a menu on the internet, and it's like anything, what's on information that you're given and what actually happens in real life is always slightly different. So knowing how wet can a flax go in a cabbage tree, and then when you need to start putting grasses. So just plant selection is generally a common one. Not planting dense enough is another one. Natives like their mates. And so what you're trying to achieve with native planting, wherever it is you're trying to have canopy closure, and that's going to suppress even just grasses, but you want to create that canopy closure, which creates that humus layer, which then over time the birds start to bring in all sorts of other species. And over time that bush will do its thing naturally. But at really wide spacing, it's going to take a long time and a lot of maintenance to get that achieved. So rushing into it, doing too much at too wide a spacing is a common one. Not doing any maintenance, just whacking the trees in the ground and then leaving them. We often see that. Planting before they've done any weed control, like convolvulus is a big one. If you've got convolvulus, it's a lot easier to spray, or convolvulus, blackberry, inkweed, anything like that. It's a lot easier to just area spray it beforehand. And convolvulus does take 2 or 3 goes to get it under control, and the planting and spraying and stuff, like convolvulus doesn't like shade, so as the plants grow you'll get less and less. It's a lot easier to do a pre-spray beforehand, and then you can also plant species like cabbage tree, flax, toy that you can spray brush killer over the top of, which makes the maintenance a lot cheaper. Whereas if you're having to cover plants and all that sort of thing to protect them from around the when you're spraying, then it just adds to the cost. So that's the main things that we see. People not doing their maintenance is probably the biggest one.
What sort of time commitment should farmers expect to set aside for the maintenance of these areas? Obviously, it depends on the size of them, but can you give some sort of general guidelines?
Like generally your first course of maintenance is in the spring, go through and do a release. If you've put in sort of 5,000 plants, that would take a crew of us, 6 people for a day to maintain that area. So our process is hand releasing around the plants to pull all the competition away, and then we spray around with a grass selective. So that doesn't affect the plants, but instead of just nuking everything, it's just more of a quality thing. But it will kill flax, cabbage tree and toy, so you've got to be a bit careful of those ones. So, and for us, that's about 15% of the cost of putting the plants in the ground. But yeah, it is like if you've got 6,000 plants, if you're going to do it yourself, you've sort of got to spend 6 days down in there releasing them. And so, yeah, so that's your spring release. And then just depending on the summer, an autumn release is a good idea as well, just to have that spot nice, and you're just removing competition from the native, so have that spot nice and clear to allow the plant to get through winter nicely. And we also find that when you do a release, the plants just shoot up because especially in spring, they've survived the winter, they're established enough, and if you do a release, they grow about 30 centimetres. So that's your initial release. And then so releasing generally a couple of years. It's just as and when required. Like if you can see the grass starting to clog up the plant, then you need to release. Things like cabbage trees, if the leaves get held together, they rot from the inside out and then they die. So just keeping them nice and open. And then just always making sure you got no blackberry, convolvulus, pampas, that sort of stuff. When you do shut up areas, they tend to grow more weeds because they're not grazed out by stock. Yeah, so just always going through and checking, and if the weeds are nice and small, then it's easy to deal with them and it's quick. As the area gets bigger and bigger, the plants start to suppress the grasses and they start to look after themselves. But like Johan said, the areas are meant to be enjoyed, like go and spend time in them and take your grandkids and your kids and walk through, and they start to have seed, like the natives start to seed, like in the 2nd to 3rd years and stuff like that. So you can go and have a look what's happening, and just always keeping an eye on it. You definitely not shut it up and forget about it. Until about 5 years, it won't go well. But after that, we always say just cruise through and just keep an eye on it, because it doesn't take much for some blackberry to get in there and it gets pretty out of control. Make sure your fences are in good condition as well, because if stock do get in there, they can cause a bit of damage.
That process of working out what species to plant, what's the best way for farmers to go through that to actually understand what to plant, where and when?
So when is the planting always sort of done in winter, so the plants can get a good root establishment before potentially it dries out. Like this summer, is just you could have planted all summer, it's been no problem, but most summers it dries out. So generally planting between sort of May and September. If you're in an area that's high potential of frost, then you definitely leave it a lot later than that. A lot of natives, when they're smaller, are very frost intolerant, and that can wipe stuff out really quickly. What to plant, it's very site specific. We try and keep it fairly simple, and you want to plant colonizing species like pittosporums, flax, cabbage tree, manuka, carnuka, those sorts of things that grow really quickly and create that canopy closure. And you'll always be able to come in and put your canopy species in at a later date, which is the likes of Totra, Rewa, Kaikatea. With our planting, we do include a small percentage of them, but there's lots of others like Rimu, Miro, all those sorts of things. They all like to have some protection. You always have the odd gaps, you always have the odd losses, but you can always go and put those bigger, longer living species in at a later date. So I wouldn't worry too much about them. But yeah, you just got to identify, generally it's a moisture content thing and a fertility thing. So on steeps, really take notice of what the terrain and how much moisture is going to be there, and flooding. If it's going to flood, then yeah, things that survive floods is important.
I should have talked to you, Anthony, eh? You sound like you're onto it.
Yeah, for us it's an experience thing. Like we've seen how wet can flax go, but if you keep it simple, that's the best thing to do. Like don't try and overcomplicate it. And if it's wet, yeah, don't be afraid of planting flaxes and grasses tend to get quite expensive because you got to plant them at a closer spacing, but they do work really well. But they also spread quite quickly because they create a lot of seed, and so they can be planted in clumps and then just leave really wet areas, and over time it'll sort of fill in. It's being honest about frost, and if it's going to flood, those are sort of the main ones that really wipe stuff out.
Hey, Johan and Aslan, have you guys got any questions for Anthony? Feel free to jump in here if you want.
Not a question per se, more of a comment relating to maintenance. And quite often we'll think about riparian management as a green infrastructure. I think you touched on it, Anthony, in the same way that you need to maintain the tractor or you need to maintain your pumps and your races in the shed. Same thing holds true for riparian management. And in return for that, there's a benefit from an environmental perspective.
Hey, Johan, what was your process for selecting what to plant?
I was in that stage of just get trees in the ground and go, and I was just going off the advice at the time. So this is my first take home for whoever's listening, is definitely what Anthony said, is talk to people before you start anything, and just have a site visit and go through, this goes here, this goes there. Because we did plant a few of those, the big ancient trees. We want to see those big monsters that you love seeing out in the bush. But that stuff is going to be when I'm an old man. Hopefully I get to see something coming through our Carnuka, Manukas and flaxes and stuff. But yeah, don't go in thinking you're going to have an ancient kauri forest or anything like that. It is a time thing. So the process we went through was the wrong way. The right way is to take your time. Like the convolvulus, Anthony, far out. That's my nemesis. Convolvulus is crazy stuff. But it does die at a sniff of anything you really spray on it, eh?
Yeah, with convolvulus, we try and do a pre-spray before we've got any plants in there. And then we also try and do that when there's plenty of it around so we can see where it is. And in those areas, we then plant flax, cabbage tree and toi. And then we also have these plant guards that if it does get away on us or we're coming in and doing areas that have previously planted, we can cover the plants and spray over the top. But it generally takes, to knock it on its head, is sort of 3 sprays. It's got a massive rhizome root system. And if you did that, that'd be over sort of 1.5 to 2 years. The trees would also be getting up then, and they would be creating some shade. And it gets carried around by all, like contractors and stuff. It's all through maize, and so it's just, it's bad.
don't get me wrong, like our place looks pretty cool now, and part of doing something like this, you get field days and people come around, and we've had great community connections, people not connected to farming at all, and they're inspired by what we've done, and they've come on and said, hey, we don't mind helping, we don't mind giving our advice and time if we can help in any way. So yeah, I've definitely picked up on a few great community leaders, and they've picked out areas within our wetland to start focusing on building up that biodiversity and really putting in those grasses and rushes to build environment to try to I better put a shout out to the Matuku bird. The Matuku bird is our focus at the moment with a few of the local community members at our catchment group, and it's really exciting and targeting those specific wet areas to try to get biodiversity in. So we're on the ball now.
In terms of the what to plant, where and when, there's quite a lot of work and guidance on the DairyNZ website. So just sort of direct listeners through to that, which will, by region, there's a planting guide that breaks down lower bank, mid bank, upper bank, the species that do best in those situations, and when you go about planting those.
Yeah, the DairyNZ stuff is probably some of the best information we've seen. And then even take photos the winter before and see where, if it's a creek, it floods to, and that sort of thing, and use that while you're doing the planting.
Hey, Antony, I think, we've sort of touched on it a little bit, but what are some of the other, the main reasons for planting on farm? Some people might think it's solely to improve water quality, which is obviously really important, but are there some other benefits?
Biodiversity is huge. Creating corridors for insects and birds to fly through. If you've got like remnant patches of bush, linking those together is really important. Erosion and land stabilisation. If you've got any sort of really marginal stuff on your farm that you think, I probably shouldn't be grazing that, but you do anyway, then having a plan to eventually retire those areas is a good idea, because, like they just run off silt and all that sort of stuff running off those areas isn't good. It just eventually gets into the streams. We often find people want to leave a legacy. Most people want to have farmed the land for generations, and often we find they've seen it be really bad and it's got a lot better, but they want to leave it even better. And so, leaving a legacy, like farmers, as you guys know, probably they feel like they're custodians of the land, so they do want to improve it, do what's right. And then carbon credits is another one that's changing a lot at the moment, but we hope that it's going to get better and better. So, but main ones are filtration and land stabilisation and erosion control. And planting, like some people, shut it up and just, if it's no good, leave it. But it's going to get very messy and stuff. Whereas if you plant it, eventually it will become very maintenance free, and it will become an asset to the farm and to generations.
There's also anecdotal evidence that suggests it can increase the value of a farm. A well-maintained, well-cared for farm with native plantings does fetch a higher price.
The time and effort to get those areas established and the cost to get them established, it's just one less thing that needs to be done.
Hey, so Aslan, from a restoration perspective, what's special about riparian planting?
Just building on some of the previous conversation, right? But it's about that transitional zone. So obviously riparian is that margin between the broader catchment land use and what's happening in the river or the stream. And so for that reason, riparian management can have a disproportional effect in a positive way. So a bigger bang for buck. Antony touched on some of the features around absorbing nutrients, filtering sediment is a key one. Well-established planting will reduce bank erosion, and that can be really critically important, particularly for sensitive downstream receiving environments. And a big one is around the habitat that it creates. And so a lot of the more sensitive species we see, particularly the insects and the macroinvertebrates, that they have an adult life stage. And so they move from an aquatic phase and a larval phase through to an adult stage, the hatch. And therefore having that riparian margin, that vegetation there, provides massive benefit for the macroinvertebrates. for the fish species in terms of broader habitat, and with that, sort of overall habitat protection and water quality outcomes.
Aslan, how does current government policy consider riparian management?
Yeah, the 2020 reforms, which probably most listeners will be relatively familiar with, they introduced something called Te Mana o Te Wai. And essentially, it's a hierarchy of protection for waterways. So that puts the health of the waterway first, followed by human health, and then productivity. So it's really emphasising that focus on the mana, or the quality of the water itself, the why. And so with that, how do we go about measuring that? Well, one of the key ways is looking at ecosystem health. A key measure for that is the macroinvertebrates, so the small invertebrates that have an aquatic phase within the waterway. And so we've got measures around that, and both the sensitivity and the diversity. And with that, we can understand the quality of a waterway from an ecosystem health perspective. There are other measures, but that is a key one. And what the water reforms have done is, with that Te Mana o Te Wai and that hierarchy, but also some of the attributes in there, there's an ecosystem health attribute, which means we need to focus on that protection of waterways. So essentially, with those 2020 water reforms, what we saw is just a greater emphasis on the need to protect ecosystem health. Riparian management is a key way to do that.
Aslan, is riparian management about more than just planting trees alongside a waterway?
Yeah, it has been. And it's, if you reflect back to the Sustainable Dairying Water Accord, one of the key actions in there was around stock exclusion, and it was around stock crossing. And the dairy sector has made massive strides in that, and 98% of waterways, or larger waterways, are now stock excluded. And so that's priority number one, get stock out of waterways. That has benefits in terms of reducing the amount of overland flow and the contaminants that are in those. And it has benefits in terms of reducing trampling of banks. And I've already discussed the importance of getting sediment out of waterways and how riparian management can do that. So bang for buck, get stock out of waterways. Good track record, and there's a bit of science that suggests that just focusing on that, a Southland dairy study showed that just keeping stock out of waterways, at least a 20% reduction in E. coli and a 40% reduction in phosphorus. Then you move and layer on top of that to put those fences back a little bit further and establish that vegetation that goes with it. And there's it's hard to study this stuff. Like, it takes a long time, and it's very hard because there's a lot of other factors that affect. But as a general rule of thumb, there's some evidence to suggest that moving from stock exclusion through to vegetating can increase contaminant removal or reduction by another 10 to 15%. So international review just on grass buffers and grass filters suggested a decrease in nitrogen, phosphorus and sediment between 50 and 75%. So large reductions there. A Bay of Plenty study, 3 metre wide buffers, suggested a decrease in nitrogen, phosphorus and sediment by between 35 and 85%. So definitely worth the investment in moving from just stock exclusion through to stock exclusion in a wider buffer and stock exclusion with the plantings associated.
Hey, so Aslan, the next question I wanted to put to you is, how wide should a riparian buffer be? And should you use native or exotic species?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ben. And I guess it's front and centre when making decisions on farm in a good scientific response. It depends, and it depends on many different things, including the width of the stream, so the size of the waterway that you're planting. Also what you're aiming to achieve. So whether that's a contaminant reduction, a nitrogen, phosphorus, E. coli sediment reduction, or whether that's a biodiversity outcome that you're looking for. Well, some of the studies do suggest, though, is that particularly for contaminant reduction, so the nitrogen, phosphorus, that overland flow stuff, you get into diminishing returns after sort of 5 to 10 metres. So if that is your focus, then it's that more near edge of waterway, that's your biggest bang for buck. So that's sort of some science around that 5 to 10 metre and diminishing return on that. For wider waterways, generally you need a wider buffer. There's a scaling effect in there. So the larger the waterway, the larger the buffer, just as a general rule around that. Ecosystem health, and we talked earlier about the macroinvertebrate community and the life sustaining capacity of a waterway, is quite tied into habitat, and it's quite tied into shade, which drives temperature and affects the plant and nuisance growth that you get in a waterway. So if you think about it from a management perspective and an implementation perspective, then thinking about the shade that the vegetation on that riparian margin can provide and sizing accordingly. So obviously a smaller waterway won't need as much, a larger waterway will need a wider width and larger trees, more vegetation. So depends on a lot of different things. In terms of native versus exotic, again, I'm going to start with saying it depends. And the reason for that is the outcome that you're looking for. So again, if you're looking at that overland flow and you're looking at filtering out particularly sediment and phosphorus that's attached to that sediment, then rank grass does a bloody good job. It creates a highly complex flow pathway for that overland flow, and with that gives time for contaminants to drop out. So that does a really good job. Ecosystem health, we need bank stabilisation as another key component of that. So there's some species that work really, really well for that. You'd want to go for larger species. The cabbage tree has a long taproot, for example, but actually slightly dirty word perhaps, but willows and poplars, they work extremely efficiently in that respect. What you need to be careful with those, though, is that you're choosing sterile variants. You want to make sure that you're choosing the right one, and nurseries and whatnot will give you good advice on that. And the final one is if your focus is on native habitat, providing that shade, reducing that water temperature, generally native is the way to go there.
Hey, so from a research perspective, are there any considerations for improving the effectiveness of riparian management?
Yeah, there are a few to take into account, and one of them is the what we call variable buffer widths. And it's just about being smart around how you go about undertaking that riparian management. And so essentially knowing your landform, knowing the contours of the land and understanding by being out in the rain and seeing where the water path flows. And you'll notice quite quickly, obviously, that there's preferential flow paths. There's areas where you get more water and they tend to be in the hollows, and you get less water in the, where you've got rises. And so if you move your buffer wider where you've got more overland flow and narrower where you've got less, then from a filtering and contaminant perspective, you get better bang for buck. So thinking about it from that context is important. Moving up to that catchment scale, generally smaller waterways, you'll get better bang for buck. So starting with those smaller waterways in your catchment and working from the top of the catchment down creates a corridor, if you like, for effect, and that will tend to have a better bang for buck in that respect. And just the final thing on that is that there's a big focus on ecosystem health, right, and improving that life-sustaining capacity and improving the number of sensitive species in a waterway. They'll often seed from upstream in the catchment, and particularly if there's native forest in the headwaters. So thinking about corridors and thinking about linking through from existing native forest in the top of the catchment and to flow that down through the catchment as well. So you get macroinvertebrate benefits there, and then also from a fish passage perspective, a lot of our native fish species are migratory, so they'll migrate in and out of catchment. So providing the right habitat for them, it's really important to have that continuous buffer length. So that being that last one, Ben, is just if we can at that catchment scale, working on having a continuous buffer length.
That's really interesting stuff. Thanks, man. Hey, just a couple more questions. Are councils or others incentivising planting in any way to speed up the current uptake of planting by farmers?
Yeah, you'll find that most councils will have some sort of scheme or subsidy in place, and quite a strong land management team to give advice and provide farmers with access to funding, or full funding or generally subsidised funding, both for fencing and planting. So yeah, get in touch with your local council. District councils also, in a number of locations throughout the country, will have a rates rebate. And so again, just an opportunity to incentivise that good environmental practice through a reduction in your rates bill. So again, jump on your local district council website and just Google rates rebate.
But that's not every district council.
Not every district council, no. So you'll need to. And sorry, mate, I haven't got a list of the councils to hand, but just if you just have a look on your local council's website, or talk to your local land management team. They'll very quickly let you know what's available.
Yeah, cool. Hey, just one more question before we wrap this podcast up. Aslan, how does the Farm Enviro Plan process support riparian planting?
It's ingrained within it, right? So you've got a Farm Enviro Plan, and we've got a very strong record of delivering, and that continues through some of our sector-wide commitments. And then that'll just be reinforced through the regs that are coming through as we speak. But essentially, riparian management is about good management practice, right? And I spoke right at the start around keeping stock out of waterways, vegetating and planting. And all of that is fundamental to improving water quality outcomes, particularly in that ecosystem health space. So a farm environment plan should have good management practice sitting at its foundation. Good management practice is exactly those things. It's riparian management. So that just flows through. A farm environment plan then becomes a really fantastic tool for understanding that in the first instance, understanding your wider catchment context and how you might link into those corridors I was talking about earlier. And then, of course, just from an operational perspective, understanding your resources, your timeframes, the costs associated, and putting a plan in place to get that done through time.
Hey, Aslan, that's awesome. Hey, and thank you very much to you, Antony and Johan, for coming on the podcast. Antony and Johan, I'm sorry, we've kind of run out of time because we've already pushed this podcast out pretty late. So we're just going to have to wrap this up. But thank you very much to all three of you for joining us on the podcast today.
Welcome.
Yeah, no problem.
No worries, Ben.
Thanks a lot for tuning in to Talking Dairy today. We hope this was a useful conversation for you. If you have any ideas for podcasts or feedback on how we can improve things, we'd love to hear from you. Please email talkingdairy@dairynz.co.nz. That's talkingdairy@dairynz.co.nz. And lastly, check out the show notes for links to DairyNZ's planting guides and other useful sites, including an article about Johan. Catch you next time.